All right. Well, we should begin. Welcome everyone to the Future Trends Forum. I'm Brian Alexander. I'm the organizer, host, and cat herder for the next hour. I'm very glad to see so many people here today. Welcome, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Now, to begin with, let me introduce everything and make sure that we all know who we are, where we're from. Greetings to people who've just climbed in. So, this is the Future Trends Forum. We're a weekly video conference discussion about the future of education and technology. We are a spinoff from my Future Trends in Technology and Education report, which is a monthly trends analysis. If you haven't subscribed to it or had a chance to read it, it's a monthly report taking a look at the previous month's developments in technology, education, educational context, mapping them against a multi-year longitudinal analysis to give us a sense of where we think education and technology are going. If it's new to you, go to ftte.us and take a look. Now, it's also a conversation that we've been having really globally. So this map shows you that we've had participation in the forum from most continents and from around the world. If you look at this map, the little yellow dots are where I've been when I've been doing this. So you can see I've been leading the forum from Finland, from Iceland, last week from Malta. But this is a conversation where we're trying to share ideas, reflections, anticipations about where education can be going. And it's very important that it's a global one. Now, we can only do this with the help of some people who have been very, very generous. So I want to thank NYSERNet from New York State, who has been sponsoring the FTTE report. We thank them for that. And we also want to thank Shindig, because obviously they have made available this great technology, but they've also made available some wonderful people who help it work. And on that note, let me just quickly mention where we are on the screen. So on the very top part of the screen, where I am right now, and you can see to the right the slide stack, this is the stage, and this is where presenters are, and this is where Dr. Rhoades will be in just a couple of minutes. Below us, you can see dozens, if not 20 people at a time. That's the audience group, or I think of it as the audience swarm. Every person, or every login, is represented either by a person smiling at us, like Dr. Cindy Love is right now, or a silhouette, like say Tabriz is. And each of those is a person or a login, and people in this group can connect with each other and have private conversations. Now, over on the the right edge of the screen, you can see there are a couple of logos, one for FTTE, that gives you the link and information about the report. On the bottom right, you'll see three teal-colored buttons, and these are very important because we believe firmly interaction. This is definitely a conversation. So the leftmost of those buttons, if you mouse over it, it'll say Ask Question. That's with a question mark. If you click that, you can type in a question you would like to ask, and I'll read it out loud, and it'll be flashed on the screen for everyone to see. If you click the Raise Hand button, that's the button with a hand on it, that tells us that you'd like to join us up on the stage to ask a question and make some observations. And we're glad to see that. And if you're new to the forum, you'll see this happens throughout the hour. So if your mic is working, your video camera is working, click the raise hand and you can join us. And if you'd like instead to text us, well, just click on the I am button right next to that, and you'll see there's a discussion room for the 20 people that have climbed in with you. And if that's not enough, if you're on Twitter, we use the hashtag FTDE, and we've had conversations happening there throughout. So use any of those mechanisms to communicate with us. Now, we need to introduce our guest and to talk about where we're going. But before I do that, I need to make a very, very special announcement. For the past week, I've been running a Patreon account. So if you would like to support the work that I do here with the Future Trends Forum or the Future Trends in Technology and Education report, please consider being a patron. We can't do this without you. This is not a profit adventure. This is something that depends very heavily on the support of people like yourself. So like they say in NPR, we depend on viewers like you. Please go to Patreon and see what you can contribute to keep things going. We thank you for that. Now, moving on, we also have to introduce this week's guest, Gary Rhoades. Gary is a professor at the University of Arizona, where he runs their Center for the Study of Higher Education. I have to say, on a personal note, I've had the really good fortune to meet with Gary. We've been on a group that works with NACUBO, the Association for Campus Financial Officers, and it's been a delight to just get to tap his extremely rich knowledge, the wisdom that results, and to benefit from the learning that he has definitely shown so many students. I'm really glad to have him on so we can talk about the future of education. Zach, could you bring Gary up on stage, please?
Good morning, Brian.
Hello. Oh, fine. Good afternoon out here on the East Coast.
Good afternoon, right.
Good to see you. Gary, I've got to ask, what's the temperature like out there?
We're actually pretending like it's winter today. So skies are blue, it's beautiful. This morning when I got up around 6 or so, it was about 27. It's now in the, maybe close to 50 now. It'll hit about 55 today.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so we're pretending it's winter here. Of course, everybody's got their parkas on. And
is that a sweater you have?
It's a sweater, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, we're here for you. We're here to support you in your suffering. Well, I'm so glad you could be here, Gary. I'm so glad to benefit from your experience, and we have so many things to talk about, so many topics. Let me ask: would you rather begin by talking about economics or about policy?
Well, they're pretty closely related, but you take the lead, and I'm happy to go in whatever direction folks are interested in hearing about.
Understood. The past 2 months, many guests on the Future Trends Forum and many participants have been expressing a wide variety of reactions to the ascension of Trump to the U.S. presidency. And many have been very concerned about what this means for education, everything from the lives of students to the impact on scholarship, to funding, to the sense of the political climate that we inhabit, to fake news, and to the question of civility. And we've had a lot of discussion about this, and we're obviously not going to stop talking about it. But let me ask, if you could, looking ahead for the next 4 years, how do you see the Trump administration impacting American higher education?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways of thinking about what's happening politically, and one of them is to focus specifically on Trump. But I think it's probably important to recognize that he's sort of a manifestation of a larger phenomenon that's been taking place for some time in the United States. So many of the policies he's promoting have been enacted before, and a lot of the debates that we're having and concerns, as you say, are getting expressed, have been expressed before. I think probably he takes them to a different level, and maybe the clearest example of that is now the planning stages of scientists marching on Washington, saying actually science is real, science matters. It's one thing to deny one little piece of things, but that's bad enough. But it's another to simply deny the value of all science, of all scholarship. And so I think in that regard, this new administration is taking it to another level. But many of these debates we've seen before. So I guess I would focus on maybe three things. Okay. And partly that's because I'm the son of a Christian theologian, so Trinities are the first one is, which it's not getting a lot of play right now, but I think this will be an area that gets played out at the federal level and at the state level over the next however many months and years. And that is the situation of for-profit higher education, of proprietary higher education. Yes. That's an area where it's not that that the president has identified a whole range of specific policies in higher education, but the general tenor of the administration, of the presumptive nominee for Secretary of Education, but also more largely of the Republican Party, is that there's been too much regulation, and in higher education as well as generally, and that they want to deregulate. And one of the obvious targets of deregulation is for-profit higher education. So I think that if you were to identify an area where the Obama administration had been particularly, or at least during that time, particularly effective, it's not that they got specific regulations enacted, although there were some. It's that over his administration, the position of for-profits really changed quite dramatically.
Yeah.
And I think we can anticipate that changing again at the federal level, but that doesn't mean there's not going to continue to be debates back and forths about the position and the future of proprietary higher education in the U.S. Because a lot of the action wasn't just at the federal level, it was state attorneys general bringing suits against particular for-profit institutions. So I think that's one area that we can see a shift.
Just a quick question. Do you see any states in particular taking the lead in that?
No, I think this has been a pretty widespread recognition that there have been substantial cases of misreporting, of misrepresentation of consumers and the like. So it's not really a blue-red issue, I don't think. It's more consumer protection. And then it's also that the not-for-profits have become much more aggressive and effective in the use of technology in delivering various types of instruction. So the field isn't quite as wide open as it was 10 or 15 years ago when the for-profits really stepped into kind of a vacant market. And so I think that's part of what's going on as well. But clearly this is going to change over the next however many months and years, that there's going to be a push to sort of re-emphasize in higher education as well as in elementary and secondary education for-profit alternatives.
Okay.
So that would be one area. The second area that I think really we don't know where it's going because, again, there's going to be a conflict between the various states and the federal level, and also competition within the federal level over the fact that a number of states now have proposed one or another version of free public higher education. And so the biggest one obviously is New York, but Tennessee's also done this, Oregon, Rhode Island. And so there's this, on the one hand, push to deal with cost, with tuition increase by saying we need to have free alternatives for at least some years, some types of institutions, some types of students. I don't see any energy for that within the administration or within the Republican Party, but that's not where all the action is, obviously, in public higher education.
Right.
But what is missing in that conversation, and it speaks to one of the topics that you indicated to me you might be interested in talking about, and that is the fact that we have essentially a huge structural deficit in public higher education and higher education generally, in the form of 3/4 of our faculty, at least, who are working in contingent positions. Half of them are working in, half of the faculty nationally is working in adjunct positions. So the issue isn't just making higher education free, it's actually investing in the intellectual workers who are delivering education, who are doing science, who are doing research for that next generation of higher education to be as successful as the previous generations have been. So that actually has been an absent conversation on both sides of the political aisle. And as we play out this free public higher education, I think part of the push is going to be, well, yeah, but even if you make it free, you still have an under-resourced set of institutions that don't have the capacity to accommodate demand for more higher education. That kind of relates then to the third issue, which is basically, and this is distinctive, I think, to the current administration and particularly to President Trump, and that is a willingness to not only withdraw from the world that we inhabit, but to withdraw from the world of reality. And so we're seeing pushes to close borders, the same sorts of sentiments that led to Brexit in the UK. Brexit took place obviously a lot earlier, and the concerns in British higher education about what is this going to mean, not just for the number of students coming here, what is this going to mean for our access to research funding from the European Science Foundation, which many British universities are quite invested in and dependent on? What does it mean for our own staff? I've seen estimates in the UK that 14% of their professional staff are members of the EU. And Germany now is pursuing, as part of their excellence initiative, an effort to repatriate Germans who are in the UK and say, come home now. It's pretty clear these folks aren't too enthusiastic about you being there. So the preeminence of the UK in higher education globally is going to take a hit from Brexit. And although we haven't seen enough evidence, it's only been a week, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But already the rumblings would suggest that just as in the post 9/11 era, we'll probably see a reduction in applications of international students. A lot of institutions are heavily committed to internationalizing their campuses and to attracting more international students for educational, but obviously also for economic reasons.
Yep.
Defunding of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts is going to be very challenging for not just those fields, but for institutions. Pretending like there's no climate change and eliminating it from websites, canceling conferences as the CDC has done, and presumably targeting those areas of research is going to compromise the ability of a lot of institutions. It won't prevent them from doing that research, but it will compromise our leadership internationally in that realm of work. So I think in a range of ways that affect not just science, but sort of the whole institution, arts and humanities, social sciences, we're going to see a system that's going to be having to, in some sense, do battle with a larger mindset that we need to withdraw from and close down our borders. We're not places that are built on closing borders.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah, quite the opposite. And so, so I think those three areas, for-profit higher education, the issue of tuition, but also staffing in higher education, because it's a matter of capacity, not just what does it cost to go, but are there people there to teach you and advise you and so on. And then just our engagement with the world and what it means for us when the federal state, the federal nation state is actively trying to close us off from the world.
That's a pretty breathtaking and heartbreaking set of challenges. Before I respond, Gary, let me just remind people we are open for your questions and comments. So if you, as I mentioned before, in the very bottom right corner of the screen, there's 3 different ways that you can respond to Dr. Rhoades' vision of where higher education may proceed under Trump, and Twitter as well stands open for your thoughts and your comments. I have to ask, do you think the Democratic Party is going to push back in a major way on behalf of higher education, or is this not a high priority for them?
I think that it's not just the Democrats in Congress or at the state level. It's also a number of Republicans who are, although maybe relatively silent, are in a variety of ways making noise about some of these issues. Maybe the most obvious one recently is a representative in Texas, Republican Representative Hurd, who had come out and said that building a wall is the least effective and most expensive way of dealing with a border. His district, I believe, covers more borderland territory than any other congressperson in the U.S. Congress. He's not alone in being unenthusiastic about a wall. He's not alone in Texas. He's not alone in the Republican Party, and he's not alone in the Congress. So I don't think it's just a Democratic Republican issue. I think when you talk about pulling out of the world, that's really an isolationist approach that is inconsistent with both parties over the past 50 years. So this is more a matter of kind of a recalibration within the Republican Party. What actually are we going to do here? So I don't think it's just up to Senate or House Democrats at the federal level or at the local level, because a lot of this stuff will get played out at the local and state level. It's kind of like, I think the president's going to get sort of Civics 101 instruction over. He's already had Civics 101 instruction. And there's obviously going to be a lot of pushback. There already has been. There's a Facebook now group of scientists who are planning a march at some point on DC, and it's already 64,000 people. So this is not, none of this stuff is set in stone. And I think it's all kind of what I'm setting out is it's all really to be negotiated. It's one thing to sort of say we're going to do this. It's another thing to actually put things into action. It's one thing to run for office. It's another thing to actually be in office and have some impact. And the concerns are not just going to come from Senate Democrats. They already are, or House Democrats. There are a lot of concerns being expressed by a variety of Senate Republicans and House members. I'll give another example. It's not about higher education, but it's related to this whole gestalt of I can just issue an executive order and we can close the borders and do what we want to do.
Right.
Not exactly a radical senator. John McCain tweeted within the last 48 hours, you can sign an executive order about torture, but there's international law, there's our law, and we're not going back to torturing people. So I think there's this sort of negotiation that's going on. And he didn't do that privately in a meeting with the president or with the president's designees. He tweeted that. So I think we're seeing a quite public negotiation that will be playing out over the coming months and years for however long this presidency lasts. And none of it is really set, but kind of the terms of the debate are being set. So I think this, as I said, in this case, it's do we close ourselves off from the world and from the world of reality, or do we engage and recognize that we already are deeply embedded in a whole variety of international arrangements, partnerships, economies, cultures, societies, and that we benefit from that. We don't just get people who are drains on our economy from them. And then the same thing with the earlier two issues that I identified: for-profit higher education and tuition and staffing of higher education. Those things are in an ongoing way being negotiated.
Gary, I've been tweeting your comments, and already in response to your call for higher education to reinvest in intellectual workers, just got a yes, 1,000 times yes from Twitter.
Well, about 2 weeks ago, I was on a call, a national press call of the California Faculty Association, one of the largest public higher education systems in the country for the California state universities. And they had done a position paper that showed over the past 30 years the disinvestment in that system, so that now there's 59 cents on every dollar that was spent back in 1985. Then they ran that sort of dropping line on the graph against the change in demographics, which is that in 1985, 67% of the students in the Cal State system were Anglo or self-identified as Anglo. Whereas today, well, 2015, which is when they ran the data up till, 67% are students of color. And so what they're saying is we're disinvesting in this changing demographic, and we need to change that for a variety of reasons. One of them is, this is our future. These are,
Mm-hmm.
these students are our future. The other is, it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the third thing that they emphasized that didn't get picked up enough by the press was, currently they're turning students away. This past year, they turned away somewhere between 14 and 20,000 qualified students. And a variety of those Cal State campuses are impacted, which means they're not accepting transfers at the same rate, or sometimes not at all in certain fields. So at the very time that we need more and more people engaged in and getting a higher education, we not only have costs being high, tuition being high, we just don't have the capacity to accommodate the people who want, the qualified people who want into the system. So I think that issue of capacity has not really been addressed sufficiently, much at all, with the exception of some groups. New faculty majority consistently weighs in on this in educational policy. And as a result, I think you see a lot of organizing in higher education, and the vanguard of organizing is adjunct faculty, national. 30 plus units over the past 2 years have organized. And whether or not you think that's a good thing, it's an indicator of this group of academic employees are saying these have become full-time temporary positions, and that's not sustainable. We need to have a system that recognizes the investment we've made, because our working conditions are students' learning conditions. You can see the same thing on the side of science, where this contingency is that lots of grad students who maybe 15 or 20 years ago felt, I'm an apprentice, I'm on the way to the good job, maybe a step to that good job as a postdoc. Well, now they're finding those postdocs become perm docs. It's a permanent holding position for a master or mistress position that's now waiting for you. And so that's become a big public policy issue as well at the national level, with NSF and NIH and the Association of American Universities weighing in and saying our sort of scientific future is dependent on investing in this generation of future scientists. So it's not just tuition that's the issue, it's what's our intellectual capacity, what's our intellectual capital as a country.
I have so many questions and responses, but let me quickly bring Vicky Romano up on stage from Oregon. Zach, is Vicky ready? She has a question.
Hi, are you hearing me okay? Hi. Well, as a person in the great state of Oregon, it peaked when you mentioned, because we now have in some form the Oregon Promise, which is 2 years community college, and I've been in touch greatly. I'm on the eastern side of the state, so our region's different than the more populated west side. But in dealing with colleagues like at Portland Community College, their issues are huge compared to ours in terms of students and retention and adjuncts, and it's just all this swirl that builds upon each other. And how are the other states dealing with this? Like, I still have not heard from Oregon how we are paying for the Oregon Promise. That seems to be I mean, we can't salt the roads here in Oregon, so paying for people to have yeah, you laugh, you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
I'm just saying, it swirls around this, but what like actual plans? Because we hear this, and as a 4-year institution, we are struggling with transfers and student services and those things, and we haven't addressed the adjunct question yet, but it's coming because we're talking in terms of increasing online student populations and increasing student. But what I'm not seeing is we're talking about the increase, but not what that increase means. So are other states doing perhaps, I don't want to say comprehensive, because the thinking is good and it's right to want to provide access. I'm not, that part I'm all good with, but where does the making it happen part work?
Right.
Is there another state that's found a path? Again, we can't tax here in Oregon either, so I'm still confused as to how this is going to happen because the tax was voted down again. So what are other states doing with these promises that kind of make that swirl happen of adjunctification and bringing from the for-profits and those kinds of things?
Right. Good question. And it's a question, it's an important one that any policymaker is gonna ask. Well, that sounds great, but where's the money to do it?
Yeah.
So a couple of things to say about it. First is there are states that for a number of years have been working through these kinds of plans or some variation of them. And one of the things that I think characterizes each of the states that's considering doing this or that's doing it is a reframing of what expenditures on higher education are. They're not just costs, right? They're investments. The students understand that. The students and their families understand that even though tuition keeps going up and the like, they're going to invest that because there's some payoff. And I think the states that are moving in this direction are recognizing, you don't cut your way to growth. You invest your way to growth. And so the first thing is just a mindset. So I'll start with New York. New York's governor just announced this last month or this month the Free Public Higher Education Plan. Like almost all of these plans, the investment is in a particular type of student with the aim of facilitating greater success more rapidly and efficiently, which means less cost ultimately to the state. And so they invest in full-time students who maintain a certain grade level, grade point average, right? And so the idea is, we've moved to this model where not only are the faculty part-time, but the students are, because they got to work so many jobs to pay for the education they're getting. It takes them now, on average, 5 to 6 years to complete instead of 4. So one first step is to recognize that if we're going to invest in students, we have to make it possible for them to succeed in a shorter number of years, which saves money. Okay, so that's kind of the first dimension of it. Change your mindset, focus on how you can effectively move students through the system. And what the negotiations in New York State dating back 5 or 6 years were, we've got this strange cycle going on. We've got the state keeps cutting, tuition keeps going up. How about if we try and calibrate those a little more thoughtfully and in ways that make it more predictable for students and their families to anticipate what are the costs of this going to be, and that will make it easier for the state legislators and governors to anticipate what will the cost be. So I think it was 5 years ago or 6 years ago that they announced the SUNY, and this was only for the State University of New York, Compact. And it was about this calibration of, we won't do any more cuts at the state level if you don't keep raising tuition. So that pushes a couple of things. It pushes an understanding at the institutional level that you have the responsibility to use your monies more wisely to help students succeed. You do that, we will not engage in these cuts. And you can see that in each of the states that's talking about this. Tennessee most recently announced a variation of free public higher education. But the idea goes back to the previous governor. The current governor is a Republican. The previous governor was a Democrat. And when the Republican governor announced this, it was pretty funny. I was on a task force of the Association of Governing Boards that was being chaired by the guy who was the previous governor who had proposed this free public higher education, Philip Bredesen. Very interesting guy. And he goes, "I'll be damned." He says, "I'm reading in the newspaper the same people who reamed me out for how this was so unrealistic and crazy and how can we afford this, and they're now supporting it because they understand that if we're going to have a good future in Tennessee, we need to invest in our students." So I think it's that it took time. It wasn't another Democrat. It's a Republican administration. So it's a recognition at the state level we need to invest.
Yeah.
And then, as you said, well, we don't have a tax in Oregon. Well, taxes, I don't know if you've all heard the line. It used to be that death and taxes were the two things that were predictable. Well, the two things Stephen Colbert says that are now predictable is death and Trump won't report his taxes. Taxes are not, our tax system is not fixed. It's a political construction. And we can change our tax structure. So there are a lot of states now that are working through how do we fund our public schools in a way that doesn't just reproduce the inequality of property tax values. So a realistic approach to this, as you're sort of nudging us to think about, is to think about the revenue side and to recognize that our tax structure is such and who's getting taxed as such that we probably need to rethink how we're funding various parts of the public education system from preschool all the way through graduate school.
Well, that's a fantastic answer to a very, very powerful question. Gary, I hope the rhetoric of investment holds out. Vicky, did you want to follow up with that, or?
Well, I think a lot of us are going to not struggle with this. I mean, again, the thinking is sound. Access is sound. Wanting our students to succeed is sound. Working with the community colleges is just a fantastic route to go. I think I just don't see the and I guess because I've been doing this a while, I just look and go, I want to limit whatever will be obstacles maybe a little bit before they come. But I think my thinking in that doesn't follow the longs of policymakers, right? I try to think in the, because this is my wheelhouse, right, so to speak. I try to limit and provide the access and get rid of the roadblocks before it happens, because the students are coming now and applying now, and I hate that anyone now would miss out on something that we won't get together for a few more years to come. So it'd be nice to at least see some of the successes. Of course, let's just do it now.
Well, I think you will see what will happen over the next several years as people will be looking at, so what's happened in Tennessee? How's it working in New York? How's it working in Oregon? And I want to emphasize how we so often in the media see this as a red-blue issue. It's politicians, but I know in my state, it may be hard to believe in a state like Arizona, but a few years ago we had a set of town hall meetings. There's a town hall process that the state. It's not state-run, it's a nonprofit organization that sets up a series of town halls, and it asks for scholars from each of the universities to write papers about some issue. So a few years ago, back in 2013, it was higher education. And they asked my center to do some papers. So we did some papers. We presented some of these issues, basically, that we're talking about here. And then you break up in little groups and talk about it. The group I was in consisted of economic development officers from municipal governments, people from the chambers of commerce, business folks. They were all saying, we can't attract business to Arizona. We keep losing out to Texas, or name the state, because the first question the companies are asking us is, what kind of education system do you have? And they ask that for two reasons. They want to know whether they're going to have decent employees, people applying for jobs, but they also want to know whether their kids are going to have decent education.
Yeah.
So these folks were, they weren't asking for a total overhaul of the tax structure, but they were saying, you know what? We've gone so far in this one direction. We need to recognize we need to reinvest in education. So I think we need to be looking not just always to the traditional places for our allies. That we've hit a point where a wide range of people recognize all of our future is contingent upon this generation of students. Yeah. The other thing that I articulate sometimes to people is, as you can tell from my picture, it's not like the picture on my website. That picture's 15 or 20 years ago. People my generation benefited from a level of public subsidy that we are denying this generation, even though my parents paid more taxes per capita than I do. So there's like this generational betrayal, really. And it's almost a hypocrisy. Having benefited from, I went through the UC system. Tuition in at UCLA when I went there in the mid 70s was $700 a year.
Yeah.
Now I benefited from that. And there's just something fundamentally hypocritical if I turn around and say, but this generation, you need to go pay way more, and we just can't afford for you to come. So I think there has to be like a moral story behind this. There's an economic story. If Arizona and Oregon don't invest in their youth, their economy is going to be a really crappy economy. But there's also a moral story about this is just what parents do for their kids. It's what we collectively, as a tax-paying generation, should do. That we have responsibilities beyond just making sure we pay less and less taxes.
Yeah.
Well, as a Generation X person, I have to agree with you, of course. But this is actually a really, really good moment to pause. We usually on the forum have what we call our Mingle session, where all the participants, that's all of you guys, all 80 or so of you, take 5 minutes to talk about these topics. And I'd like to ask you to think about the forces that Dr. Rhoades has just articulated. How are you seeing these play out where you are? If you're in North Dakota, or if you're in California, or if you're in Wisconsin, or if you're abroad, are you seeing opposition to these trends? Are you seeing a look towards returning to reinvesting public higher education, or are you seeing the Trump-embodied forces continuing on? So let's take 5 minutes and talk about this. Gary, we'll have a chance to, along with Vicky, to join the crew downstairs in this big crowd. And what you do in order to talk to somebody is very simple. You just click on them. So if I take a look here at, say, Paul or at Cindy, I can click on them. And if they would like to speak to me, then our two avatars will click together and we'll have a private conversation. Now, if you don't want to speak to somebody, either because you're busy or your mic doesn't work or you're shy, that's fine. Just you have the option to refuse connection. So you can just do that. So let's take 5 minutes and mingle right now. Let's think about these forces and how they're playing out in your area. And we'll get together in 5 minutes. Mingle. Well, we are done with our mingle. And I had a really good conversation with Cindy just a minute ago. Gary, I just had a really good conversation with Cindy, and she brought up 2 points. She works in DC with some associations, and I was wondering if I could just run these by you. She mentioned that the word on the street is 2. One word is that the major concern is financial support, financial aid. And the second is that the best way to appeal to people to increase spending is to talk about gainful employment post-graduation. How do these sound to you? Does it sound like it's the national current?
Hospitals based on how many people don't die in the hospital. So the incentive for the hospital is never to admit anyone who might die. Right? It's like
Right.
So sometimes, like, and the concern about gainful employment was the same. Are you only going to be rewarding certain fields? Are you going to be pushing institutions to only prepare students in certain high-paying fields? And when would you do the analysis of their gainful employment? A lot of times people graduate with degrees in English or history. They ultimately end up working in some other sector. They're using their education, but it's not like this clear link to English. So the economists who study this may study occupational attainment and salaries 5 to 7 years out, but not just the first year out. for example. So some of the devil's in the details, but that regulation about gainful employment ran into a buzzsaw, and the buzzsaw was not just the for-profits resisting it. It was community college representatives. It was representatives of comprehensive state universities who were concerned that, well, if they're going to apply it to the proprietaries this time, then they're going to come after us, and it's going to be a regulation that concerns us.
Do you think Trump will
I
push
think
this?
it's a rational idea, but I wouldn't look. It's an example of the type of regulation that this administration is most likely to sweep away.
Okay.
So the little that we have, it's most likely to go away. That would be my prediction. On financial aid, the big issue that's most likely to change is whether the banks are cut back into the student financial aid game. That was a huge thing for the Obama administration to bypass the banks, to pull them out of this process. And obviously, this is an administration that isn't short on billionaires, and they haven't drained the swamp. They've actually refilled it more aggressively with the same sorts of animals, only richer ones. So I would anticipate that there will be more pushing of various forms of privatization, and this would be one, to get the banks back into the student aid game. The thing that would make the most sense in student aid is to allow students to renegotiate the terms of their loans, just like anyone can do on other financial aid, forms of financial aid. But I don't see that actually happening because, again, it's not something that is going to gain a lot of traction, at least not currently in the administration. That would be my prediction. I agree with both. Financial aid's a huge thing, but I just don't see it increasing.
Well, thank you. Let's bring Cindy up for our last question so she could follow up. Cindy, if you're making camera up, why don't you join us?
This administration, this is what we're just racking our brain over. What is the very best message we can get through? And we all, of course, agree with investing as opposed to cutting. But what we're hearing when we give that kind of message is, why would we invest in a failed ship? Students aren't graduating at the rates they should. They're not getting jobs. You have failed. We're going to invest in something else. I mean, it's a quick response. So would love to hear any of your thoughts on, we may only get one shot at